Hi, Nicola. Guys, it's one of residents, famous live at 53 Mitchell Street in Narrabeen, and I'm also Zali's electric business manager. Firstly, welcome. I know it's always hard coming out on a school night or a work night, so we really do appreciate you all being here. Zali's going to come on shortly, and she will do an acknowledgement of country. The electric office team is also here, as well as team of Zali volunteers, and you've probably noticed that there's a fair bit of ankle or teal, some with badges, some with t-shirts. So please come up to us at the end and say hello, and if you do have any questions, we're here to help. So you're probably wondering what I do as an electric business manager. Sometimes I ask myself the same thing because every day is different and every week is different. But what I can tell you that since Zali started in 2019, we have opened 42,000 different cases for correspondence. And in that correspondence, it had to cover a whole range of things. Top of the list, and no surprise, climate, environment, F11. Second on the list, opposing the religious freedom bill. Third, and probably again no surprise, is COVID. We had so many queries around COVID. There was lots of fear, lots of confusion, and lots of correspondence. And the last one, again, probably no surprise to anyone, is the Israel and Palestine conflict. We get a lot of correspondence, but it's really important that we do. It's important that we understand the sentiment and the views of the electorate, and it's actually what helps inform policy. And quite often Zali will call us when she's down in Parliament and asking, what does the electorate think of this? Sometimes we'll also set up surveys so we understand and we can track what people are saying. Zali always promotes what legislation is coming up and invites people to offer views as well. But I know you're not here to listen to me. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording this, so feel free to put away your phones or even turn them off. But if not, please put them on silent. That would be very much appreciated. Toilets, if you haven't already found them, you go out the door, turn right, you will find them just a little bit up the hallway. And for those who are thirsty, because it is quite warm in here, there is some water at the back. Questions. We've had lots of people that when they registered, they also wrote some questions in there, and I know some of you didn't get a chance to do that. So we have collated the questions that have already come in, but at the end there will be an opportunity to ask questions if Zali hasn't covered off what you've come to find out. So without further ado, and actually, as I said, I know you're not here to listen to me, I'd like to introduce Zali Steggall to the stage.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all being here. It is so exciting. This is our first big event in this new area for Warringah, and it is really special to have so many people from the community here. I would like to start by saying a huge thank you to my team, Nicola and everyone that's here, the volunteer team and the staff from the office who have really helped put all this together and to be here after already a long day down in the office. I'd like to start by acknowledging the First Nations peoples, the Camaragal people. Of course, there are different groups of people from now this much larger Warringah that we have. But it's so important, and I was so incredibly proud of our area during the referendum that in fact we had a really strong vote in relation to reconciliation and recognition. Warringah, old Warringah was about 60%. Here, North Sydney was very high as well, and that is really important because our area has so much beautiful heritage that it's always really interesting for people to find out more about what's available. And it's really important to understand that, because I think for Australia to really reach its full potential, it has to reconcile with its past. And I think that's a really important part of it. So of course, we're here because unfortunately the Australian Electoral Commission has abolished the seat of North Sydney, which does mean Warringah is now a much larger seat. And it's really important to come up here. Kylie couldn't be here tonight. Well, to be fair, I wanted her to have the night off with her family and kids, because it's been an incredibly difficult and challenging time not being able to continue with the division of North Sydney. But what we know is it's really going to mean a growth and much larger electorate for Warringah. So obviously from the other end of the beaches we have lost some areas to Warringah, being North Curl and Dee Why, Forestville, Killarney Heights, but the areas now in Warringah, because the seat of North Sydney has pretty much been split into 3 areas to join up with Warringah, Bennelong and Bradfield. So in terms of joined up here, we have Camaray, Cremorne, Crow's Nest, which we had parts of Cremorne before but the full amount, Kirribilli, Lavender Bay, we have Waverton, Wollstonecraft, McMahon's Point, Milson's Point, and of course the North Sydney CBD, which is a significantly different area to the rest of Warringah, and I'm very conscious of that, and that's why it's really important for me to hear from the community. But we are also excited to welcome that sort of new opinions and new views on issues, which I think ultimately makes for better representation and better outcomes in Canberra. We have a very vibrant multicultural community of families, young professionals, health workers, business leaders, entrepreneurs, and the statistics are slightly different for this area compared to other areas, so I'm very aware of that. And again, I want to thank Kylie Tink for the fantastic, and her team for the fantastic work they've done over the course of this term of Parliament. I must say, it's being a second term for me, I've really enjoyed the camaraderie and the professionalism of having a larger crossbench. It's enabled me to really understand, learn from people who have a more diverse and different professional experience to me. And for me, that's been really compelling. Look, I have to say, enjoyed having a crew of strong women there. I think I've really enjoyed that aspect, but also women with very strong professional, capable backgrounds, which is incredibly important, that have brought passion and a lot of issues to the fore. As an independent, you can't tackle everything, but as a collective, we've been able to really engage on a number of issues that are really important. So for me, tonight is a first step. We've been door knocking, we've been out talking to members in the community, but it's also about addressing and understanding how best to represent your views and the particular issues of this area in Canberra. So we have had a survey out over the last couple of months, and we've had a number of really positive responses, a significant number of responses to date. The main issues, probably not a surprise to many of you: climate and the environment, integrity in politics, cost of living, healthcare, housing affordability. These are key areas that I think resonate in every community in Australia. When asked about issues or projects residents would like their local representative to advocate for, answers were varied. However, I would say there are some very recurring themes. Increased investment in active and public transport, and that I certainly welcome. I know that's important. Including better cycling and pedestrian infrastructure. Stronger climate policies, music to my heart. That is certainly one of the main reasons I got into politics, was to get into merit-based policies when it comes to dealing with the challenge of climate change and transitioning our energy and really engaging and taking advantage of all the opportunities the transition to net zero offers. Also enhanced funding for public services, including healthcare, education and social support, and that is such a core part of the work we do at the Electoral Office around NDIS and aged care. They're all areas that are incredibly important. Urban planning and housing strategies to address affordability and sustainable development. Absolutely key areas. There's no doubt that is the challenge of this last term of Parliament has been that real crisis around housing opportunity, whether it's affordability or supply. They've all been issues that have really engaged a lot of people. And obviously government accountability, and I think that again is a key part. If we don't have integrity and accountability of government, we don't have visibility on process, and you really can't get to the bottom of whether the right decisions are being made for the right reasons. So thank you to everyone who's submitted questions for tonight. Some of the key topics which have come through are, again, climate change, gambling reform, and that I feel strongly about that because because of the social harm that creates. Integrity in politics, truth in political advertising, again, something I have been championing for the last 2 terms and we definitely want to see moving on. Housing affordability, security and supply, local transport and traffic issues, including the Warringah Freeway, which I know how distressing much of that has been. And of course, the not-so-regional pool of North Sydney pool. Poor Kylie, look, I have sat next to her in Parliament and she has inherited that. It is maybe a legacy of a system of how we, grants were allocated and projects were maybe determined. So from my point of view, these are all really important issues, and there's ones where you can chip away and you can really create solutions and get achievements done. So for me, it's always about I guess my goal, I'm not a career politician, it is about taking Warringah to Parliament, to making sure its voice is heard. For me, politics is about people and policies, it is not about power. And so for me, it's about those outcomes and making sure your voice is heard. It is also about pulling back the curtain on Parliament. Too often, I think Australians, we disengage with politics. People say, well, I don't really like politics, I don't really want politics in my life. But unfortunately, politics is in your life because politics and what happens in Canberra determines the laws that impacts the outcomes and influence on your opportunities, your children's opportunities, and so many other things. So it's really important to engage with it, and that is, I think, at the heart of the community independent movement, to engage with politics and really hold representatives to account. So for the last, it's nearly 6 years now, it's quite amazing to think it's been so long already, since 2019. It's been an incredible journey, working first with the Morrison government and now this term with the Albanese government. And people often ask me, what is it like, the job of being an MP, especially not being a career politician? I think first and foremost, it's actually the serving the community. So as Nicola said, it's all those local resident inquiries, and all too often I had people, especially during the first term in Warringah, who said, look, I didn't know we could actually get help from our local federal MP on these issues. And especially when you think of COVID and that needing help to get in and out of the country, getting exemptions, the travel, but also getting help on your NDIS plans, the delay sometimes that those systems take, or needing to challenge an outcome. Aged care, really important. The delay is often very problematic for families. And of course, it's also dealing with Centrelink, and where people, the most vulnerable in our community, are needing those systems to work. And it's really important for that to work. I'm sure many could remember, for example, the wait lists on passports post-COVID, where there's a delay in getting things done. And so the team had to really work hard with those departments to get things happening. So of course so that number one part of the job is that liaising with federal departments, and so immigration as well, helping on behalf of visas. Sometimes it's businesses needing help to get key staff in or into the country. It can be family members needing assistance or review of decisions. So for me, that's a really important core part. It's also making sure our area benefits, right, and has that equal sort of opportunity. So one of the criticisms of independence is often, well, you don't have a seat at the table, so what are you going to deliver? And people tend to think about roads and, the pork barrel at the end of the day, how much money can be delivered to an area. But ironically, there's some data that's going to be coming out that because we've been proactive about it and we've been working with our local community, non-for-profit organisations and businesses to make sure they understand where the opportunities are to engage with the federal government, where the grants are, we've actually had a huge uplift in financial support to Warringah. We've had local grants, community groups, businesses, club, to the tune of some $298 million. So it's always that good news story. If people judge success by dollars on the ground, then I can assure you that a proactive approach to working for the community, for local business, to make sure they engage with the programs and look for those opportunities, we can deliver results in that way as well. And that's been some key funding achievements. For example, Manly Surf Club retaining the $5 million pledge, an additional $5 million pledge for Manly Warringah Gymnastics Centre, which will be a centre of excellence for young gymnasts as a pathway to the 2032 Olympics, $2 million for Middlehead Oval upgrades, and all those, and that is also then grants around businesses that are accessing NRF and other programs like that. So really important aspect of the job. It's also been around some of our key institutions and non-for-profit around services like the Dalwood Spilstead Service for early childhood and family services, grassroots community movement, really effective. So from a legislation point of view, again, really important to have that voice and to really fight for the issues. So key issues we've had have been PEP 11 around offshore oil and gas drilling. That took concerted community effort from Manly to North Sydney to Newcastle to really let all levels of government know that the community was against these projects. And it took a lot to get it done. It took some 4 years. It took a Prime Minister putting himself into a resource portfolio. It took a lot of meetings. It took putting 2 private members' bills forward. And for many people that may not know, in fact, I had a number of meetings with the Nationals member, Keith Pitt, who's retiring, who was the federal minister in charge of the decision for PEP 11. And his intention was to approve it. And that was going to be so problematic, obviously, for the Morrison government, that the decision to refuse that licence was one of the only decisions Prime Minister Scott Morrison did in that secondary portfolio of energy when he appointed himself to those additional portfolios. So that's telling just how much that community pressure had built up around that project, that was the extent of the steps that, you know, the Prime Minister of the day was prepared to go. So obviously that is that was key importance. Another key project was around the Climate Change Act to legislate net zero by 2050, to make sure governments are committed to that we have that line in the sand. It's telling that during the course of that first term, that was very much, the pressure was on both major parties, and the very first legislation the Albanese government passed was in fact to legislate net zero by 2050. That did not happen by accident. That happened because of the pressure community put on the major party to do that. We of course, there's been a lot of other areas of legislation. So this term of Parliament, I've moved something like 360 amendments and had about 20 passed. I know that may sound like a small proportion, but they're important. They're amendments such as ensuring First Nations voices are a priority and a consideration in future Made in Australia. They're ensuring that the climate statement is issued to the Parliament on a yearly basis. It's making sure that our next nationally determined contribution under climate, under the Paris Agreement, will be science-based. So these are all really important areas to keep fine-tuning. Of course, it's also being a voice for so many areas. On small business, I meet regularly with the Chambers of Commerce. I know the challenges small businesses are under. And so there's been a real political power play between both sides of government, between Labor and the Coalition around the small business asset write-off, and whether it should be 20,000 and when it should be greater. And the reality is the call from industry, from COSBOA, which is the Council of Small Business Australia, and others, is that they need it to be 50,000. And so I moved amendments to that. I put both sides on notice that these are the kind of measures that small businesses are needing. In terms of again, events to bring Canberra to the community, that's really important, that you have the opportunity to be heard from ministers directly. And so I hosted 2 forums on NDIS where Minister Shorten attended in person and online. Again, it was to give, while we were having the review into NDIS, to give that opportunity to the community to be heard directly by the minister in charge. Incredibly important and moving when people that were, you know, that rely on the NDIS were able to directly recount their experience and how they needed the system to work for them. We've also had on ageing and aged care and a great seniors guide. So I'm not making a reflection on the age of anyone in the room, but if you have the care of anyone that you need some support, and the seniors guide is a very helpful tool, and it came from actually just lived experience from members of our team that found the system, between the online and the hard copy, just so incredibly challenging to navigate between local government, state and federal, and pulling it all together in one place to assist the community, I thought was a really important step. And it's been a very popular item, and so I encourage anyone who hasn't got one to please get it, and we've committed to updating it, obviously, as the legislation has changed. In terms of the work on legislation, as I said, truth in political advertising and accountability matters. So a first step the government did in this term was legislate the National Anti-Corruption Commission. But I moved amendments that I felt that the threshold for corruption should have been placed lower. I think at the moment where it's been set, it's not meeting public expectation in relation to certain conduct. And I think unless you can see anti-corruption working, it's very hard to believe that it's effective. I think the onus of proof in relation to public and private hearings should be reversed, and that, if I am returned to Parliament, is a commitment for me to keep advocating for. We need to have better transparency and accountability of decision making, and that anti-corruption piece is vital to ensure trust in decisions and making sure that spending is for the benefit of the community and people, and not just for other interests and other issues. In relation to some of the other amendments that I've passed, in relation to fair work legislation amendments, secure jobs, better pay. We passed amendments around clarifying a small business, what it means. We were able to negotiate with the government to change where that threshold was. Now, a lot of the things we pass, they don't make the headlines in the papers, I can assure you. They are chipping away at problems. They're improving legislation. Often it might be raising an issue during a briefing and it is then adopted by the government. Or it might well be that the Minister of the day will say, we'll take that on board, but we'll deal with it in the other place. And we've then been able to work really collaboratively with the crossbench in the Senate to pass on that feedback, what amendments are likely to succeed, what might not, and then they have been passed in the Senate. And so that's been a really important way. It's important to understand. Media will often try and make out that a large crossbench is dysfunction or will be chaos, and I can still remember the headlines before the last election. But in fact, what we've done is we are fairly united on process. We have different views as to merits of issues and form a different opinion on votes, but we are fairly aligned on values when it comes to effective government, making sure that it is an efficient and effective process for the government of the day to deal with the crossbench and the opposition. We have we actually nickname it speed dating, where the ministers will come and present to us on a Tuesday night, the crossbench, the House and the Senate, all of the bills that they intend to table over the next following days, the justification for those bills, and then we obviously flag where we're going to do some follow-up, and individually or collectively what amendments or what issues we have with those pieces of legislation. And I always, I base that on feedback that I've received from the community and stakeholder groups. We also have a regular briefing with the opposition, with the coalition, where they identify their grounds for disagreeing with the government's legislation and maybe alternative policies. So it's important to understand that as much as media does not always like the idea of having to deal with too many people, it's a bit pesky, it's easier just having two sides to deal with. The reality is it's very effective, efficient, and whilst we have very different views, I can assure you Bob Catter votes very different to how I do. We are very focused on ensuring it's a productive and an effective way of representing our communities. We have, in terms of areas, of course, there's been truth in political advertising is another area of integrity that's mattered a lot. When I first got into politics in 2019, coming from a commercial barrister background, I was astounded to find out that there is no truth in political advertising. That whilst we protect our consumer rights, right, we value our money, so we don't want to be scammed when we buy or sell something or purchase a service, and yet maybe one of your most important decisions, your democratic right to vote, does not enjoy the same protections as your consumer rights. And I find that staggering. We value our consumer rights more than our democratic rights. We don't apply the same protections. So I do feel that it's important that we have truth in political advertising. And whilst the government had committed to do it, and they did table a legislation just a couple of weeks ago, they have declined to put it on for debate. And I've been urging Minister Farrell to do so, to put it on for debate, to be genuine about that commitment, but he has shirked that. Instead, favouring donation reform and other legislation, which I, of course, was not happy with either, and may have confronted the minister on that front. It is really important to have a process. I respect we won't always agree on the outcome, on the merit, right? But I guess my barrister background would say I really value respectful dialogue and negotiation. I've attended many a mediation as a barrister, so I know the drill of you're going to have to give a bit, you're going to have to, everyone's going to have to put something on the table. But you can come to an outcome that is beneficial to the vast majority. And so I don't, when you find out about outcomes through the media, which is maybe the way that, a lot of old school politicians like to do things, brief the media first and then you kind of present it as a fait accompli in Parliament. I don't think that's respectful of our communities. It's not respectful of our democratic process, and so I will call that out. In terms of recent legislation, of course, we had scams prevention framework. So when I talk about consumer protections, this is a massive area that's been under-regulated for a long time, where consumers are really left and victims of scams. And it's an incredibly confronting. So many people are really embarrassed and afraid to report, and yet it's impacting so many people. We do so much more of our transactions online now, and it is so easy to be scammed. I have had family members scammed, and it's incredibly hard to recover compensation. And so I was able to negotiate at the very least with the minister that we reverse the onus of proof, that the victim should not have to prove whether or not a financial institution or the banks or a telco has complied with the code and taken reasonable steps, that the onus be reversed. So it's not an absolute fix, but it was trying to try and reverse that onus and make sure victims have a more even opportunity to challenge and recover compensation, because it really is a David and Goliath bill. As I said, Future Made in Australia, there was guarantees around First Nation communities and traditional owners participating in and sharing benefits of the net zero transition, which is really important. We know around the transition that a lot of regional communities are finding it challenging because some communities have relied on fossil fuel industries for a long time, and they need to understand the transition and where the opportunities are. But other communities have never had that, right? And so they are now faced with having to look at transmission lines, and the consultation is incredibly important. So again, the detail in legislation matters, and for me, maybe because I was a barrister, it's engaging with the law, and the detail is something that matters a lot to me. But alongside with crossbench colleagues, we've put our, collective voices around getting changes to HECS. The indexation timing and amount was incredibly flawed. And anyone with a family member with a HECS debt will know how crippling that debt is, and the rate at which it was increasing was just simply unfair. So being able to press the government into enacting change has been really important. There is more work to do. We still need to change the date of indexation. It's still not fair. Paid parental leave. So single mothers, where the paid parental leave cut out at too young an age, we were able to push the government to bring it to 14. This was a basic core policy recommendation to ensure better outcomes for women economically. And of course, major parties will say they were getting to it, but it's often with pressure and community engagement that we finally get it over the line and get it done. So that they're just some of the areas that are so incredibly important to have an engaged community. And I would say, whereas having an independent, you really are part of that process. On domestic violence, it's a scourge of our society, and it's something that I get just incredibly angry and riled up about. I was able to pass a unanimous motion that both the government and the opposition voted in support in relation to really drawing a line in the sand of what needs to be done. We need more than words, we actually need action. So calling a national cabinet to say it's a crisis is one thing, but acknowledging the funding changes that need to happen, the services, the front line, all of those things are incredibly important. So that motion called for things like increased funding in relation to frontline services and access to legal services, in particular for First Nations Australians. It was a national review of sentencing laws, because as much as we often sentencing laws are a state issue, but they are failing us when it comes to domestic violence. They are not acting as a deterrent to stop the scourge of the problem. Removing character references in bail sentencing and sentencing issues. So being a good, of good character should not be relevant when one has been found to commit such heinous crimes and be exercising so much pressure. And there are so many fantastic organisations locally. I visited Mary's house here in North Sydney recently, and it is manned by volunteers, right, that are putting in so many hours, but they deserve so much more support. So we need to ensure government is held to account in providing those services and the funding. A big issue for me around climate is climate risk. So unfortunately we have a certain amount of heating that's baked into the system. I'm really focused on having ambitious goals to decarbonise and reduce emissions. But the reality is we've already pretty much we've passed 1.5 degrees, and 2 degrees is still going to be a challenge. With that comes risk. So with every degree of warming comes an increased amount of humidity in the atmosphere. And you would have all noticed our storms are getting so much more severe. We know bushfires and droughts, and the experts call it essentially climate whiplash, where we're going to go oscillate from these extremes that seem irreconcilable. They're such extremes that it's hard to imagine they're all happening within the same mix. But the reality is that's what everything's happening. It's being supercharged. And with that comes increased risk, which is translated to your insurance premiums. One of our biggest inflationary measures, if you look at your household kind of expenses, is actually your insurance premiums. Since 2022, they've increased by 32%. And unfortunately, they're only going to go in one direction. If climate risk isn't mitigated, there is no other way. Insurance companies calculate their risk yearly, and they assess it on climate risk. And we will not be able to insure our way out of the climate crisis. And when I think of how much of our national wealth is built on our ownership of homes, and that then so much of our homes are at risk, I'm really worried about how much of an iceberg crisis and issue this is. Currently, about 1 in 20 homes around Australia are uninsurable. By 2035, it'll be 1 in 10. So that's really challenging when you think of how much of our system is predicated on that value. Think of how much of our banks have residential mortgage portfolios. Those banks, when you get a mortgage, requires you to say you've got insurance. But they don't check in every year. That insurance, it's only if you're renegotiating or if you're selling or buying. And then the value of properties will really be impacted. So I've hosted a climate risk roundtable where I had the Insurance Council of Australia, I had banking, I had minister representatives, I had non-for-profits, I had civic society, and I had local government at the table, because everyone needs to be there to solve this problem. And so I have a private members bill around climate risk and adaptation, which I'll be shortly, releasing the exposure draft. I've been dealing with all sectors to make sure this is robust and addresses the need. But to me, this is a massive area to ensure we are standing and preparing for communities, making sure our communities are safe. And I have had the odd person say to me, well, I live on a hill, I'll be fine. My house won't be exposed to flood. The reality is the way insurance premiums are calculated is it's averaged across the postcode. So even if your house is not at risk, I can assure you, you are paying for the overall risk in your area. And we can't have a situation where so many people are at risk of losing their homes, their lifetime's possessions by those kind of events. And unfortunately, those events are happening more and more frequently. So it's really important to work with that and to keep assisting in that, because it is, when we talk of cost of living, there are so many pressures that are exacerbated, and media will often say to me, well, surely for this election climate is on the back burner because cost of living takes centre stage. And I say it's a false premise to suggest that the two are separate. The two are interlinked. Every aspect of cost of living will be made worse by climate change. So it really has to be addressed. Government can do both. Address short-term pull policy levers to assist cost of living, and address long-term challenges around climate risk. These things are incredibly important. So that, I guess, is an overview of my focus. I think for me at the core, again, I'm not a career politician. This was not on my bingo card when I thought of my career, from going from being a professional athlete to a lawyer. But I really feel strongly as a mum. I have young adults who are now in the university system. I worry about their future. I worry about their opportunity around housing, that it be affordable and available. I worry about what kind of debt and how will they manage that. I worry about the environment we're leaving them. I think ultimately climate change and our environmental degradation is one of our worst intergenerational debt that we can have left. It's not too late though. Like, I am here for hope. I am a glass half full kind of person. You don't become a skiing world champion from the beaches without having a fair amount of hope and optimism. So from my perspective, I know that we're around 40% there when it comes to transition to renewable energy. We have record amounts of rooftop getting installed in Australia. We have one of the highest uptakes actually in our area around electric vehicles. I supported the introduction of the fuel efficiency standards because that drives choice, and choice means you all get to choose what you really want to buy. When you have that opportunity to transition to a different, whether it's a washing machine, cooktop, whether it's a car, I want you to have choice to be able to choose low emission options. So the rise locally in uptake of EVs has been 173% since 2022. That's pretty good. I think that deserves a clap, because we can do this. We have the technology to reduce up to about 90% of emissions. We just need the political will. And I think that's what I'm here to pledge and to commit to you, that is my political driving. That drives me. You know, there are days that are tough down there, but there are days where you really know you're fighting for change, you're fighting for merit-based policy, and you're fighting for community to make sure that their voice is heard, and that you have that opportunity. So that's my big pitch to everybody. I'm looking forward to questions, but I have got some of the questions that were entered through the survey and registered, so I'll tackle them so that we can get there. What is Zali's attitude to nuclear versus renewables for Australia's long-term future? Well, in 2019, I was actually on the committee inquiry into should we lift the moratorium on nuclear energy, and that inquiry was in fact chaired by Ted O'Brien, who's now the Shadow Energy Minister. So he's very familiar with the challenges. He has changed his tune though, I should say. So the report identified the biggest issue is social licence, and how to really get that going. The problems of lifting we have moratoriums legally, whether it's federal and state, so lifting that, getting consensus across our country and federated country is difficult and will be lengthy. It's also the time and cost aspect. So part of that delegation, we went to India, and the Indian Energy Minister and Nuclear Minister gave us a briefing and told us about the challenges and how they went. And they were a little, I guess, surprised that Australia was considering it, because they identified that they could get a renewable project up in 18 months, and it took them 18 years to put up a nuclear project. And so they couldn't quite understand, between the cost and the speed, how or why we would do it. I've talked about it with a lot of leaders in the business, in the energy space, also diplomatic community, like with the High Commissioner for the UK, for example, where they do have nuclear. And overwhelmingly the feedback is you have to play to your strength as a nation. And Australia as a nation, our strength, what we have in abundance, is wind and sun, and we have space. And so it really defies belief why you would go for something that is so much more, it will take so much more time, will be so much more complex. We don't have the workforce or the skills for it. It will be incredibly expensive. When you look at depreciation curves, the only energy source that gets more expensive over time is nuclear. that goes significantly over budget, whereas in contrast, renewables are constantly going down. The cost curve is coming down. So from my point of view, putting any kind of other concerns aside and waste and obviously, there are so many other issues you can really dwell on. I just look at it from a pure speed and economics point of view, and I look at opportunity cost. And I think we are in a crucial decade to reduce emissions. We're halfway there. We're over 40% renewable in the system. And I think that's a good news story, right, that we need to focus on. And as an ex-athlete, you don't go halfway through the race, turn around and go back to the start line and go again. You keep going. You stay focused as you are. And I think that's a really important point. Thank you. So I would have to say my answer to that question, I don't see nuclear in our long-term future. I think we have an urgency that we have to address. Most of our coal-fired power stations need to retire by 2035. They are akin to keeping your oldest, clunkiest car on the road that is most inefficient, that requires a service or a mechanic every week to come and check that the parts are still working. We have to close them down, and we need to do so and turn to technology and energy that's available and that can deliver and that empowers every one of us. How do we ensure that our government acts with integrity, gives us the truth about issues, and then acts based on science and facts? Oh, well, that's a very good question. Well, look, I think it's important to have effective scrutiny. So process in Parliament matters. Too often, government of the day uses its numbers to gag debate, to shortcut that. One of the things I see of a minority government, the power of balance, is actually enforcing better process, making sure we have that scrutiny. I do want to see a stronger National Anti-Corruption Commission. I think we have to, it was a great first step to get it implemented, but I think there's a lot of, it has not met community expectation in relation to transparency or the standard of conduct that is considered corrupt. So I think that's something that really needs to be addressed. I think it has to be stronger whistleblower laws. Now, they were promised but not delivered, so that's really important. It has to be around truth in political advertising. Again, we should value our voting rights, and we shouldn't have it. I think it's like, it's not like a political scam. And we take action on scams, but we don't when it comes to political promises. How can you and other independents collaborate with the major parties for policy outcomes? It seems the major parties act in bad faith towards independence, i.e. the Electoral Reform Bill. Well, I think, look, when it comes down to brass tacks and the day-to-day operations, we do. I've had a constructive relationship with a number of members of the Parliament, a number of ministers, where I've been able to get amendments accepted or passed. We've been able to achieve results for the community, and it's been a really productive and positive outcome. But the reality is that the last election, 1 in 3 voters voted independent or did not vote for the major parties. So the model is under threat. So I would say, imagine Coles and Woolies are in charge of writing the rules, are in charge of how much they take from the public purse to keep themselves in power, and that's essentially what they have done, right? There's been a strong push for greater transparency around donation reform and real-time disclosure, and I don't disagree we need to take money out of politics. But I also don't agree that it should be the public that pays for it, right? It's one thing to say you're taking big money out of politics. It's another thing to provide a 47% rise by the 2028 election to how much the public will pay per vote. And that is a story that I think is just obscene, and it is insulting to communities and everybody doing it tough. There isn't a sector of government, I think job seeker, think housing assistance, there isn't a sector where there's been a 47% increase to how much the public or people in need or vulnerable people get. But without the blink of an eye, the major parties were happy to sign off on a deal that saw a 47% increase to how much the public purse pays per vote. I think that is outrageous. In addition, there were a number of other measures in that bill, like uneven caps between independents and parties, having access to a national, pool of funds that is far disproportionate to individual seats. But the other offensive provision of that bill, which didn't get much traction, is actually an administrative assistance payment of $30,000 per lower house member for an incumbent. So I will benefit from it, and sure, that will assist me in meeting the compliance cost. But what they've done is there's no economies of scales in the major parties. So basically for every MP there is a 30,000 little pot that goes into the coffers, and the Act included that amount could be spent on things like the interest payment on party loans. It can be paid on party functions, travel expenses, but you name it, it was included essentially. And I think again that's obscene. People are doing it tough, and it amounts to, on current numbers, something like $4.82 million going from the public purse to the major parties for administrative assistance. I just think that is obscene. And then the kicker, the stinger in the tail for this, was that a challenger does not have that funds. So an incumbent can have the benefit of all that assistance, but someone challenging an MP that's already in a seat will not get access to that assistance. And I think that's fundamentally unfair. Our democracy should be available to everyone who wants to challenge an incumbent, and you shouldn't have embedded advantage. And the irony was that the minister actually said to me, and members of the crossbench, well, what are you worried about? You know, you'll be fine. You're already in there. This should be fine. That's not the point. We're there. I am there to try and ensure more people have access to this, that we actually have a more representative democracy. And so, to me, it was just absolutely fundamentally wrong, which is why I did tackle the minister in person in front of the media. Since we had received the amendments through the media, I figured we should have the debate in front of the media. I don't think I'm on the Christmas card list. But the collaboration, I think, is very possible. I've done it over 2 terms of government. You know, there's a lot more work that happens behind the scenes that you don't always see up front. Joint standing committees where we work that are multi-partisan, a lot of issues get covered. Locally, a key issue that's been raised has been the council rate rises, and I know that's incredibly distressing. North Sydney, an 87% rate rise is incredibly high. Obviously, down at the other end of Warringah, there's been a rate rise suggested of 40%, which is also incredibly challenging for residents. I think, again, I've urged, it's a local government issue. I can't do every job, but I can certainly apply pressure in terms of how spending occurs. So it's really important that there be cost savings and efficiencies found within all levels of government, and for local government to focus on that. But it's also important to be factual about this problem, and it comes back to that growing climate risk. There's been a shifting of responsibility onto local government of a lot of expenses from state governments and federal government, and it ends up being local governments that are really left holding the bag. And ultimately it's residents, because local government's main revenue source is residents through rates. And so there is something it's unsustainable, and the model needs challenge. We know, for example, the New South Wales government broke its commitment to cover 50% of library costs, operational costs. Now that's something like 156 million to council budgets, right? So every little broken aspect makes a difference to your rates, because then it has to be covered by somewhere. We know, for example, in 2022, the cost shifting added to local government expenses was something like $1.36 billion, which is $460 per ratepayer. So this is not a simple point the finger story, it is a complex story. We know councils fund part of New South Wales emergency services, including the SES and fire and rescue. The emergency services levy alone cost council $165.4 million last year back to state government. So there is a lot of ways in which the council, the local government, and I'm not here to stand up for them, but I am conscious that if our system is going to work, we need all levels of government to take responsibility. And fundamentally, federal government needs to come up with, I think, a better model. At the moment, we obviously have New South Wales is not getting its fair share of GST revenue, and that is impacting cash flow as well. But then there is this addressing of climate risk. The growing bill around disaster cleanups is growing. The amount of storms, the damage that is caused, and that is part of the problem. So I've met with the council, I've met with the mayor, trying to understand The pool, North Sydney Pool, which is the next one raised. Look, that was a $10 million grant under the previous previous government out of the Regional Communities Fund. As you can imagine, regional communities are not very happy with North Sydney, but it didn't even come close to the ultimate cost of that project. So I think it's really important to assess that. I'm committed to working with the government, working with the local government, also conveying to federal government if additional grant funding is going to be needed, how can that be achieved, making sure communities are not left holding the bag for that. So I don't have a magic wand to fix the North Sydney Pool, I've got to be honest on that, but I do understand the importance that it not be communities and residents that are left holding the bag for that situation. So that is a commitment for me that I've already had for the rest of Warringah, but for this area in particular, to make sure good decisions are made. I know there's going to be a lot more questions, and I know public transport is one that comes up a lot, but I think maybe we'll go to questions from the crowd. I'm happy to take questions. I may have to take some on notice, but I'm okay with that. I prefer to give a genuine answer than a I don't have talking points given to me from any major headquarters, so but I'm really looking forward. But thank you for having me. It's so exciting to see so many people from the community here tonight. It says to me you are an engaged and active community that really matters, so thank you.
Hello, Jared from Ulster. Thank you for that, Zali. I just wondered if in your survey there was no mention of how we're going to pay for all these extra services that we know need improving. So was tax reform coming up? I believe one of your colleagues, is it Allegra, is all over that, but is that something that you see as part of your agenda as well, or your Sydney?
What?
Your seat agenda.
Well, I think as a nation we have to engage with this problem. We know we have a fundamental problem. Currently there are 4 people working for 2 people not working within our system. We know that in 20 years' time that will reverse. So there will only be 2 people working, 4 people not working. So fundamentally, if government relying on individual tax as a revenue, the main revenue base, is not sustainable. Anyone with kids, grandkids, the burden will it just simply won't stack up. So we do have to put tax reform on the table and look to how best can we do it. Is it looking at around improving productivity and company tax rates and those kind of things? It is looking at issues around how do we move away from a model of relying so much on income tax to other models. And that has to be looking at other tax bases. So that is looking at areas such as, obviously we have state taxes and federal taxes. It is looking at areas such as, obviously company tax rates. We have to look at, from a housing point of view, we can improve supply, but we have to look at costs. How do we do that? We have to put on the table the discussion around capital gains exemptions and negative gearing. Now, of course, before anyone panics, this is not about the family home, but we do have to have a long-term conversation about where are we heading. One of the other issues that was raised in the survey was housing and housing opportunity and housing affordability. We have, after about 40 years of policy, gotten to a position where housing has become an investment means, a wealth building means, but it's no longer an opportunity for everyone. People don't have that opportunity to have safe housing. And I do feel fundamentally that is a basic right we have to cover. So the question is, can we look at cascading models whereby there are certain benefits for initial investments, but they decrease over numbers of investment? Other jurisdictions are looking at that. I think we need to look at the question around the growing cost of climate risk. We need to look at fossil fuel subsidies, the diesel subsidies, not for farming, right? This will get misconstrued. It's not looking at impacting farmers, but we still subsidise fossil fuels to the tune of $11 billion a year. right? And that has to change, because the counter side of that is people like you are left to pay for increased insurance premiums, increased levies at council rates because of all those risks escalating. So we have to start looking at displacing those costs and those incentives. But yes, it is on the table. We have to look at it. Of course, major parties will be very reluctant to do that. They always look at the quick, short fix, the populist idea, rather than long-term reform. It's part of the problem of having short-term of government, and also I think it's much easier to be populist than it is to talk reform and deep-seated reform.
You said early on that the Gaza genocide was one of the main things that people were writing to Zali about, and I've heard that from Julie in the office. So, and you see, there's a question on that. Now, the Albanese government has not condemned Trump's ethnic cleansing plan for Gaza, nor has it condemned the Western Bank genocide of Palestinians. So, how are you, as an independent, going to differentiate yourself from the two major parties that support Israel in whatever it does, willy-nilly, and condemn the genocide and ethnic cleansing? Will you demand... will you do anything different at all? I've had lots of letters back from you or from your staffers, and you're saying things like, I have deep concern for loss of life on both sides, which really doesn't get us anywhere. Are you going to differentiate yourself on this issue of patrols?
Well, look, thank you, and I agree. A lot of people have been incredibly distressed, right? I guess I do also take the pragmatic view of what is within my power to do, because I don't have a direct line to the Prime Minister of Israel to tell him what he should and shouldn't do, right? So I think we have to also be really mindful of not importing a foreign conflict into Australia, whilst also standing up for our values. And so to that end, I think we have to also, how this conflict started matters. So I have had a lot of meetings and engagement with both sides of our communities. In particular, many Jewish Australians incredibly distressed by the events of October 7, but also distressed of being blamed for then the situation of the Palestinian people. It's incredibly confronting, and people have been very polarised around this conflict and the outcome. When my position has been, I think it's really important that we remain respectful and maintain our social cohesion, because there is no strength in disunity. We are always going to be stronger that way. So in terms of what to do, obviously supporting the calling out and the call for the return of hostages, incredibly important. The issue around anti-Semitism, incredibly raw for so many people in our community. But also meeting with Médecins Sans Frontières, meeting with a number of charities and organisations for what do they need on the ground to ensure aid is happening, calling for a ceasefire, calling for a measured response. Calling for the international court to be respected. I have stood by that, and I have met with Penny Wong to discuss, to get a real update on how much aid is entering Gaza to make sure Palestinian people are, that we don't have just such a horrendous issue. But she was quite frank with me of what is within her power and what is simply not, in terms of continuing to advocate for increased humanitarian aid and making sure that access is there. Where I can have that real impact is actually when individual cases are brought to me. So in 2020, in my first term, I had the pleasure of meeting several young Palestinian men who had come here, a NIPPERS program for Norstein Surf Club, right? You shake your head, but it's important. That program was incredible. It was about taking water education to children in Gaza. This was an outreach program between Norstein Surf Club, northern beaches here, all the way to Gaza. On visas approved by Peter Dutton, right? So clearly past security checks and all of that. Christmas Eve, 2 years ago, I got the call that they were in desperate need of help, that they couldn't get out, and that they, needed to access visas. Some had already been killed in the conflict, but some could get out. I was on the phone to the minister, I was writing letters, I was advocating for them to be able to access the visas and what was available to them. And then when they were, by some miracle, able to get out and find safety in Australia, I met with them in my office in Manly. And it was pretty moving to sit there meeting this family with beautiful kids, just wanting safety and security for their family. And then advocating for them to get better support here and be able to actually start a new life. And that was a time where then, in counter to that, I had the opposition calling that we shouldn't be allowing any humanitarian visas. There should be no access to war refugees, which would be a complete departure from position Australian governments have always taken in relation to people seeking refuge from a war and a conflict zone. And so I called that out. So that is my commitment, that I will do my utmost to continue pushing the government for all the steps it can take, realistically take, whilst being mindful of social cohesion within our community, and stand up for all within our community that are feeling harassed or discriminated or unseen. And I appreciate that is not going to keep everyone happy, because this has been a conflict where everyone wants you to either be to one extreme of it or to the other. But I don't think that's realistic. Again, everyone has their view. The difficulty around this conflict has been it's been incredibly distressing. And what I've seen, what I've witnessed in Parliament has been from one side of politics to the other side of politics, seeking to capitalise on community distress, genuine distress at what is happening for political gain. And I find that abhorrent. I have abstained from those votes, because I don't think that is conducive to outcomes for our community. So from my point of view, it's been a commitment to ensuring we call out discrimination and racism where it happens. That's important. We have got a real issue in Australia with a simmering racism that crops up during times of conflict and different times. And it has to be called out, and that comes back to all of us and our responsibility. So that is my commitment, and then to push for that respect of international law, call for making sure there is law, that there is humanitarian aid getting in.
Good answer.
Hi Zali, my name's Erin from Camaray. Recently, since October, there have been 4 or 5 local councils who have voted in favour of liaising with the state and federal governments in regards to DNA contamination. That isn't recent, however, it's just recently coming through the local councils. People like myself, a scientist background working at CSL in the pharmaceutical division, have been fighting this for years. I believe that the jabs were never safe. So it's growing now, the local councils. It started at the town of Port Hedland, then Sejuna, West Tamar, where a GP has now become a politician, Dr. Sladen, Port Macquarie. And I'm just wondering what your team, how they're going to react to this. Not you, but you, in a lot of people's, non-scientists, portfolios, the DNA contamination and all of the harm from the COVID jabs and the underreporting that's gone on, and the scary thing of the TGA being funded by 96% by pharmaceutical companies.
Well, look, I was in Parliament, obviously, when we were challenged with COVID, and the statistics around the death rates and the risks that were posed were significant. And so I think it is a primary duty of government to ensure our communities are safe. Will all the responses be absolutely perfect every time? No, I accept that. But having spoken to a number of health professionals, and overwhelmingly the data shows that whilst I do accept that there have been side effects and that people have been impacted by the vaccines, but I also know many lives were saved by the vaccines. And so you have to take that into account. So when the government did institute a review of the COVID response, I pushed for it to be a full Royal Commission with full powers so that we could fully investigate all the allegations and all the concerns. The government chose not to. It chose to make it a smaller investigation, didn't have the full inquiry powers. And with that meant that they didn't have the the power to compel state governments to provide the information. I was horrified as a Member of Parliament during that term. I felt like we were living in 7 countries, right? I didn't feel like we had a united Australia. We had 7 things happening across the country with different rules, different places. To me, that should be part of our learning curve of how do we address and confront something like a pandemic and something like that better. Because it will happen again, right? I hate to say it, but one of the health risks around climate change is greater risks of pandemics and viruses. So we have to learn from that experience, and it was a global steep learning curve for many, to make sure we do it better. I pressed the government to ensure we had a CDC, a Centre for Disease Control, a national centre that actually works with all states to make sure we have a more unified approach. That has been accepted by the government and will be implemented. But I do accept that greater compensation and acknowledgement and assistance to those who had an adverse reaction to the vaccine is important. I've written a number of applications and assisted, supported applications for consideration through the process for compensation and reconsideration where claims have been rejected. So I respect that that is the experience many people have had, but I do still overwhelmingly am thankful that our ultimate death toll was not what it could have been. Any other questions? Yes, sorry.
So I have 2 primary school aged children, and as part of the free route where there can be an unduty exhaust step within the street here. And in my school, there were 10,000 children for tournament education issued in this area. And I realise that this is a state government issue, but what you to do the climate pressure?
Look, air pollution is incredibly important. I think Australia, we benefit from a better than other nations, but it doesn't mean to say it's perfect. And air pollution, once you have that concentration of traffic, becomes much more significant. Of course, transitioning to electric vehicles will make a huge difference to when it comes to certain toxic and fumes from vehicles. But the filtration from stacks of tunnels, it has been a long-standing issue with state governments. Essentially, it's a money thing, it's a cost thing. And my understanding, obviously I was engaging with this issue a lot when it came to the Beaches Link tunnel proposal, that whilst we have to progress our infrastructure and create ways in which we get more efficient transport, right? We can't have congestion the way we have at the moment. We also need to make sure it's safe and healthy. I totally accept that. And so for me, it is that question of what are the barriers to filtration to those stacks? Why is the cost so prohibitive when on so many other areas of technology we are able to bring the cost down? What I have been sort of told unofficially, part of the reason there is a reluctance to introduce filtration now is it means retrofitting everything else, right? And if you've been able to get away with it in other places, why would you start creating a problem? But again, I often use the analogy of, I think back to Manly Beach in the early 2000s, where we thought nothing of pumping sewage out to sea, right? We used to say, right, you send it out 1 kilometre out to sea and she'll be right, don't see it. But yet, of course, in stormy days and bad weather, our beaches definitely bore the brunt of it. It was not such a big policy change to then get to having sewage works, to having treatment, that we got into that process. It is that next step around transport, about ventilation, of respecting and valuing clean air to make sure we put in place the technology. The technology is there. It can be done. So I accept the need for better with the ventilation and the filtration to make sure that it's not dangerous and creating adverse health effects, especially when there are young kids and schools in the vicinity. I am also pragmatic, but we are living in a modern world where we all commute and do a lot of travel. And I know this area has a great metro, but other areas of the electorate does not, and is heavily reliant on the road access. And it's incredibly frustrating and congested. So we need to have better solutions when it comes to public transport, but I absolutely do support the need to ensure that we take air pollution seriously. Any other questions? Okay, well, I've kept you all here. It's been a great year. I don't know what time we were due to go to, but if there are more questions, please write in. I'm always, we do our very best to answer. We've got a lot. There will be more forums during, oh, sorry, there's one more. Sorry.
If you want to feel with crow's nests, I believe you've opened a new office down in Manly. I just wondering, knowing that the lecture comes up with 2 crow's nests, I thought you might have opened one halfway towards us, so that we know that you are really amongst us.
Well, the thing people don't realise, I actually don't get a say. So my old office was Tony Abbott's old office, and he had actually been looking to get to a new office for about 5 years before he left office. So the old building is now due for renovation, or I believe demolition, and leaked atrociously every time we had a storm. So I had a request to be relocated for some 5 years. Unfortunately, maybe it's a sign of the administrative side of it. It takes a long time. There are a lot of safety requirements around electoral offices, and I think, maybe referring to that question earlier, and social cohesion. Our electoral offices are manned by a lot of volunteers and local residents who are generally there just working for the community. But their safety has at times been put at risk, not for me in Warringah, but in other electorate offices where they have had graffitis and protests and attacks, and it's been very challenging. So, as you can imagine, and I welcome it, the department has a number of stringent guidelines around offices of where they go, and one of them is actually size, and it's incredibly hard to find a commercial size sufficient to meet their requirements, to have the disability access that it should have, to have internal car park and all those kind of things to make it safe for an MP. But you would know I've had a campaign/community hub in Mossman for some time, which is funded through donations and volunteer manned, to make sure that the Lower North Shore community had access to regular meetings and a touch point beyond having to come down to Manly, and I know that's incredibly important. So with this much larger electorate, and it's ironically we are now split 50-50. 50% of the population is north of Spitbridge. That Spitbridge is really a drawbridge in the middle of our community, and then 50% from Mossam to Wollstonecraft, Lower North Shore. So I think it's incredibly important to have a presence down this side, and if I'm re-elected, that's absolutely going to be a consideration for me. I do appreciate it's going to be a long way from Wollstonecraft to come down to Manly, but I'm also very willing to travel. I'm always very happy to have meetings up this end as well. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. If there's no more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.